Hi, hello, and welcome everyone to Livermore Lab Foundation's Summer Speaker Series. This is the first in a four-part series that we have put together for you all. My name is Sally Allen. I'm the Executive Director of the Livermore Lab Foundation. We're an independent nonprofit organization and strategic philanthropic partner to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, dedicated to advancing science and inspiring the future scientists and engineers of the world. This is a really exciting year for Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory as it celebrates its 70th year of advancing science and technology on a mission. We're really pleased to kick off this speaker series today with our talk From Berkeley to Berlin with our speaker, Tom Ramos. We ask everyone to please remain muted during Tom's talk, and you can use the chat feature today for any questions that you may have, which we hope to have time for at the end. In case we do not, this talk will be recorded today and will be uploaded to the Foundation's YouTube channel later this summer, so we will let you know. Today, we've asked a special guest to introduce Tom's talk. Juliana Shu has been at Livermore Lab for 26 years, supporting the nuclear deterrent and working on stockpile modernization. Her background is in weapons design, and she is currently the W87-1 program manager. Here's Juliana with more on Tom Ramos.
Welcome, everyone. I'm honored to introduce Tom Ramos to speak on the history and the inside stories of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and its role in the development of modern nuclear warheads. The subject of the nuclear deterrent can be contentious and emotional. At the same time, our nation's decision on the future of our nuclear warheads can have tremendous impacts on our national security and international stability, as demonstrated in the recent Ukraine conflicts. A solid understanding of where we have been and how we got here can provide lessons for our future. With his wealth of experience, Tom has done us a tremendous service by having done detailed research of its history. And he brings the story to life by connecting us with the people who made it happen. Some background on Tom. Tom is a West Point graduate and earned his graduate degree in high energy physics from MIT. He joined the laboratory as a weapon designer, focusing on the X-ray laser program and participated in numerous nuclear tests. He further served the nation by going to Washington and working on arms control, supporting the very important and delicate negotiation of the START Treaty with the Soviet Union. After returning to the laboratory, he established a counter-proliferation program to prevent rogue nations from producing weapons of mass destruction. It was a laboratory project, but I have also heard our colleagues referring to his approach as being an entrepreneur and a CEO. And the program was instrumental in establishing counter-proliferation plans for the nation. There's tremendous respect for Tom for what he has done. Please join me in welcoming Tom for his lecture today.
Well, thank you, Sally, and thank you, Juliana. And without further ado, let me bring up hopefully this will show up in a second. Yep, my slide. So what's this history about? And especially if I can refer more to our younger members of our audience, those of you starting out in your academic careers and hopefully pursuing a career in science, that you need to understand that Livermore has a rich history. The laboratory had a very rich history in bringing very, very young people. When we started this laboratory in 1952, probably the median age of a member of this laboratory had to be in the lower 20s, 24, 25, fresh or 26, fresh out of college and starting a brand new career in national security. And it can be a subject that's sometimes filled with all sorts of tension and other things that we see today. But I assure you today is nothing compared to what some of us had to experience. I remember when I first started at the laboratory in the 1980s, I remember one morning having to get to work. I had to go past 5,000 demonstrators standing on the corner of East Avenue and Vasco Road on my bicycle and mucking my way through 5,000 individuals, some of whom attempted to physically stop me and made my way through just so I can get in and to do my work. And although it was contentious and people were accusing us of doing evil things, in fact, we were taking great steps, it seems to me, to protect our society, protect our country from harm. And in fact, the story I'm about to tell you is our very first people who worked here back in the 1950s took on that challenge very seriously and succeeded, even to the point where the President of the United States came out here to personally thank our scientists and engineers for averting a nuclear war. And that's what I think I'd like to go into with this story. Without further ado, let me just go into that. All right, the story begins around 1928, I guess, when Robert Sproul, he was the president of the University of California. He recruited a promising PhD student, a PhD recipient, Ernest Lawrence, to the laboratory. And Sproul wanted to take Berkeley from being a scientific backwater into one of the world's leading institutions in science. And Lawrence was going to be his ticket to accomplish that. And Lawrence didn't disappoint. Within a couple of years, he invented a machine that came to be known as the cyclotron, which would eventually win Lawrence the Nobel Prize. In 1931, Sproul gave Lawrence an old engineering building, a disused wooden building on the Berkeley campus, to house a brand new 27-inch cyclotron to go in. And with that building, when he moved in, Lawrence created what came to be known as the University of California Radiation Laboratory, or as most of us call it, the RAD Lab. And the RAD Lab was a huge success. It attracted some of the most significant scientists, or especially experimentalists in the nation, young American physicists and engineers, to work in breaking open the atomic nucleus and understanding the secrets of the nucleus. And they made great progress. In fact, 5 members of the RAD Lab would later go on to win Nobel Prizes for the work that they had done, with Lawrence's leadership. Things began to change in December 1938 when nuclear fission was discovered in Berlin, Germany. Berlin, Germany at the time was under the rule of a man named Adolf Hitler. And Lawrence, like some others, was extremely concerned that this discovery of this brand new energy, which was 1,000,000 times more energetic than, say, the energy of a high explosive, could be used to make a weapon that could be used to further Nazism and to cement a world war. And in fact, in September of 1939, Hitler did start World War II with his invasion of Poland. During the war, Lawrence was called back to Washington, and a man who might be called the president's advisor, scientific advisor, his name was Vannevar Bush. He asked Lawrence to help develop a brand new technology that had been discovered and developed by the British, called the cavity magnetron, but it promised to radically change the way radar sets worked to make them much more effective. But the British needed help to develop it. And Bush asked Lawrence to create a laboratory that could do that. And Lawrence came through and created the MIT Radiation Lab. The name kind of took off after the UC Radiation Lab. Then he had the MIT Radiation Lab at Cambridge, Massachusetts, at MIT. Later, that would become, today it's the Lincoln Laboratory. But anyway, he got things started. And then later, back at the RAD Lab in Berkeley, he developed a machine that could extract uranium-235 from natural uranium, because it had been calculated that in the discovery of nuclear fission in 1938, in December, it was really a minor isotope of uranium-235, that actually is doing the fissioning. Now, an isotope means it's an element, the same, it's like any other uranium element, except that it has a different number of neutrons in its nucleus. And so the predominant isotope of uranium was uranium-238. This particular isotope, which had just been discovered 4 years earlier, was uranium-235. And it was uranium-235 that actually create the fissions. And so in order to make a bomb, you had to extract uranium-235 from uranium-238. And chemically, you can't do that. Chemically, they're identical. But Lawrence invented a machine that could do it. And in fact, it was accepted by the government. And the government created the Manhattan Project, and Bush, still leading the atomic program for President Roosevelt. Then they authorized the construction of a plant built at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, called the Y-12 plant. And in the Y-12 plant, they placed these calutrons, as Lawrence called this new invention. And there in the picture on the right, you can see these technicians, mostly ladies at the time. These were high school graduates, that they're running the calutrons. And those technicians are actually enriching the uranium to an extent that that is where the fuel came from for the first atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, right from that particular plant. Also back at the RAD lab, another physicist who worked for Lawrence, his name was Edwin McMillan, he decided to replicate the experiment that was done in Berlin by a man named Otto Hahn at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. And he replicated that experiment to see if he too could see nuclear fission. And he did. He was able to see it again, but McMillan took it a step further and really examined the results of that experiment much more. And he realized that neutrons not only split apart nuclei to form nuclear fission, but some of the nuclei absorbed the neutrons to create what we call radioisotopes. And these particular radioisotopes decayed fairly quickly, within 4 days. Half of them were gone within 4 days, into a brand new element that had never been seen before. And McMillan called it neptunium. And then joined by another RAD lab researcher, a chemist by the name of Glenn Seaborg, the two of them worked together, and then they discovered that neptunium also decayed very rapidly into a brand new element, which they called plutonium. And so two of the major discoveries and two of the major contributions to the atomic program in the United States was done right there in Berkeley with the invention of the calutron and the discovery of plutonium, which became, of course, the principal fuels for the nuclear weapons that were used to end the war. All right. Sorry. Uh-oh. Let me see if I can forward this thing here. There we go. So now during World War II, when the government, the Army, United States Army, was asked to create a program to develop the atomic bomb, and this was called the Manhattan Project. The leader of the Manhattan Project was a general named General Dick Groves. And Groves flew out to San Francisco and he met with Lawrence and he asked Lawrence to create yet another laboratory to design an atomic bomb. And Lawrence was sympathetic with the wish. He knew that such a laboratory is needed, but he had his arms full trying to get the Y-12 plant at Oak Ridge operating, as well as making sure that the plutonium research was going well. And so he recommended, Lawrence recommended that Groves enlist the theoretical physicist at the RAD lab, a man named J. Robert Oppenheimer, and let him take the lead on that. Groves interviewed Oppenheimer, agreed, and then Oppenheimer was asked to start the laboratory, which he did at Los Alamos. And so Los Alamos then became the new home where scientists got together, they designed a nuclear weapon. The enriched uranium came in from the Y-12 plant. The plutonium came in from the plant up at Hanford, Washington, and the rest is history. It ended the war. Now, one thing that's interesting is during this period, two of the physicists who had been recruited to come to Los Alamos to help design these things was the very famous Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, Nobel laureate, whose close friend was a Hungarian-born physicist by the name of Edward Teller. And Fermi challenged Teller with the question. He said, is it possible that an atomic bomb could actually generate enough energy to start fusion reactions? Or as physicists tend to call these reactions because they occur at high temperatures, thermonuclear reactions. And Teller thought about it for a while and came back and told Fermi, in fact, he thought it was possible. And Teller came up with a design or a concept he called the super. And with that, Fermi and Teller worked together during the war to see if they could make a super type weapon workable. And not much progress, frankly, was made during the war. Most of the emphasis had to be on first getting an atomic bomb. But once the war ended, then attention went back to the super. And in 1946, there was a conference held on the super. And Teller was recruited back into Los Alamos to try to develop this thing. He stayed there, created a group. One of the members of his group was a Polish mathematician by the name of Stanislaw Ulam. And Ulam worked with Teller, and they devised a new idea for the super. I won't go into the details, but they were having many, many physics problems trying to make this concept work. But in March of 1951, they co-wrote a paper which devised a brand new idea for how a super might work. The idea was accepted by the Atomic Energy Commission, and then the Atomic Energy Commission then ordered Los Alamos to then execute an experiment to see if their idea would work. And that experiment became known as the Mike event, which tested the Mike device in November 1952, which was the very first test of a thermonuclear weapon, what we all call a hydrogen bomb. There's a picture of it on the bottom right. And that thing was almost 1,000 times more powerful than the weapon over Hiroshima. And with that, however, another thing happened that got Lawrence's attention. Just as in 1939, his attention was drawn to the Nazis in Germany having access to nuclear fission, and Hitler might be able to build an atomic bomb with that. So too, after 1949, the Russians then demonstrated they could detonate an atomic bomb, and they became a nuclear power. And Lawrence was well aware that the Russians knew about the super, and that they probably were also working on a thermonuclear weapon, which they were, as a matter of fact. And so just as he was concerned of Hitler having an atomic bomb alone in the nation, how dangerous that would be, he was also concerned that Joseph Stalin, the head of the Soviet Union, might have a hydrogen bomb by himself, which would also be just as disastrous for the world and for the United States. And so Lawrence once again went back to the government and tried to innovate the government to start research on a thermonuclear weapon to match what he knew the Russians would soon be coming up with. To do that, he looked at the program, and he realized that the program needed an isotope of hydrogen, which is called tritium. And in order to produce tritium, he created a reactor, or he built a reactor that could generate that. And the government gave him a site. He asked for a site to put this thing because it was much too big to put into Berkeley at the campus. And the government offered him any of these old World War II military sites. And he and Louis Alvarez, his chief lieutenant at the Rad Lab, Alvarez and Lawrence went around looking at these sites. They looked at Camp Parks in Dublin, for example. But then they came to Livermore, and they looked at the Livermore Naval Air Station. And frankly, according to Alvarez, Lawrence stepped in and saw the Olympic-sized swimming pool at the Naval Air Station, which was used to train Navy pilots. Took one look at the swimming pool, looked at Alvarez and said, "Louis, we found a home." And so, with that, Lawrence accepted responsibility for placing this huge reactor, the Mass Test Accelerator, the MTA, and they built it. And there's a picture of it being built at the Naval Air Station in Livermore, which is now Building 431, by the way. It still exists at the laboratory. With that, nevertheless, Oppenheimer had become reticent about doing thermonuclear research. In fact, was totally against it. He had pretty much taken a complete reversal in his mind about doing thermonuclear research and felt we should not be doing it, even though he felt that if we didn't do it, the Russians wouldn't do it. Most people disagreed with that, including Lawrence, and felt that we were approaching a dangerous stage in which the Russians may be in sole possession of a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. The government felt the same way, and a commissioner from the Atomic Energy Commission flew out to Berkeley and asked Lawrence if he would start a laboratory that would specialize in doing thermonuclear research. And Lawrence agreed it had to be done. And because they were already, the Rad Lab already had operations going on with the MTA at Livermore, he accepted responsibility. And so Livermore then became the home for a new laboratory. And that sign on the top shows you it's the University of California Radiation Lab. That's the Rad Lab. But now there's a Livermore site, Site 200. The site at Berkeley was called Site 100. Livermore then became known as Site 200, and it became an adjunct onto the Rad Lab. And Lawrence became overall director, but he asked one of his physicists, a man named Herb York, to take over operations at Livermore. And so York became an associate director of the RAD lab, if you will, running operations at Livermore. Nevertheless, it's important to note Lawrence was still in charge. In fact, Lawrence spent a lot of his time out at Livermore during especially the first 2 years of its existence, making sure that it got started correctly. It was on the right track. All right. One of the legacies of Lawrence, is he had a management system he used, which we call matrix management, in which you have your parent divisions. You have your physics division, you have your engineering division, you have a chemistry division. Later on, you'll have a computer science division. And these divisions were populated by experts in those disciplines. But when a need arose, a specific need, then you created a program to answer that with the goal of answering that need. And you appointed a program leader. And the program leader then would draw experts from each of the divisions, put them into the program, and launch that program to solve that specific problem. All right. And so this was done, and it's called matrix management. At this time, and I'm sorry that I'm so short in time, I can't go through a little bit more of the history, but Lawrence had grown a close relationship with a man named David Griggs, who was the physics division leader at RAND Corporation, which is a think tank created by the Air Force down in Santa Monica, California, a nationally renowned think tank. And Griggs had his people come up to Livermore to work with the scientists at Livermore to put together what we might call a national deterrence strategy, a strategy to carry us. How are we going to respond to a nuclear-armed Soviet Union that was intent on invading Western Europe and was intent on spreading communism all over the world? How do you handle a nuclear power like that? And so these intellectuals came in, and one of the legacies of Lawrence is with his matrix management, these political scientists who were renowned. These were world-renowned people like Bernard Brodie, I listed them there, William Kaufman, Herman Kahn. By the way, Herman Kahn wrote the book on thermonuclear war. Hollywood would later portray him as Dr. Strangelove. So if you ever ask the question, who is the real Dr. Strangelove? There he is with his thumb sticking up in the corner. His office was right here at Livermore. In fact, his office was right next to a physicist by the name of Mike May, and they all worked very closely. Albert Wallstetter, very famous architect for nuclear deterrence. They came here to Livermore. They worked with our scientists, and together they put together a strategy on how to stop the Soviet Union from dominating the world with communism. So a little bit more about Lawrence's matrix management system. And you see a picture of him there with Herb York and with Edward Teller. And I explained it to you, but there's a picture below. There's Jim Wilson. He's a theoretical physicist, and it's kind of an example of this. Here you have a theoretical physicist giving a talk to a bunch of engineers and experimental physicists, and they're all working together on a single project to develop a thermonuclear warhead. Okay, and it's kind of a prime example of how this kind of stuff would work. And it was extraordinarily successful, and it made for a highly innovative environment at the laboratory. Another important aspect in this early period of the laboratory was the presence of John von Neumann. Von Neumann was a Hungarian-born mathematician, arguably the most important mathematician of the 20th century. I won't even go through half the accomplishments he's made, other than to tell you that any digital computer that you use, including your iPhone, owes much of its architecture to John von Neumann. He was more or less like Alan Turing. Alan Turing, by the way, worked for von Neumann. Von Neumann took Turing to Princeton and got Turing to get his not Nobel Prize, but to get his PhD in what we now would call computer science. And Turing and von Neumann worked closely together to establish computer science for the world. Von Neumann was here all the time. He was here in Livermore, worked with our scientists, and encouraged them and convinced the scientists at Livermore that in order to understand the research they were doing, they had to use computers. They had to use computer modeling to do that, and encouraged them to get the best computers available in order to accomplish that. In fact, I've spoken to several leading physicists at the lab later on, like Mike May, John Knuckles, Johnny Foster, and they all have a similar story that one of the first things that happened to them when they arrived at the laboratory was John von Neumann came up to them and told them they needed to write a computer code in order to understand what they were doing. So I attribute when I arrived here too, I noticed Livermore had a distinct, what I call computer culture. And it's just that you did not do experiments unless you could successfully model what you wanted to do on a computer first. And then you conducted an experiment to verify your calculations. This is important because using a computer allowed an experimentalist to go beyond simple models in their mind. You know, if we try to do something in your mind, you make it highly symmetric. It's a sphere, it's a square, it's something like that. But with a computer, you can go into more difficult types of geometries and other types of problems and allow the computer to handle that kind of complexity. And that allows, if you will, that allows that scientist and engineer to leapfrog ahead, way ahead, by trusting in his computer science. Now, part of this, I think, that happened here, why it happened here, besides von Neumann being here, was the vast majority of our people here were very young. They were in their 20s. And just like today, our young people are much more adept at using an iPhone than I am. So too, the young people in the 1950s were more inclined to accept this brand new computer science and to trust a computer to do the right thing, rather than older people saying, I wouldn't want to trust this machine. I would trust my brain before I trusted that. And so it gave these young people a great advantage, and it pushed them very fast forward. Another individual I have here, and I'll speak very quickly about him, is John Wheeler. He's in the bottom picture. Wheeler is arguably the greatest American physicist of the 20th century. He coined the phrase black hole to describe a star so massive that even light can't escape from it. Many people know about Richard Feynman. They know Richard Feynman. Well, Wheeler was Feynman's thesis advisor. Wheeler was a phenomenal physicist. He came here and was also a regular presence like von Neumann, and physicists would just circle around him, and he would work with the physicist on problems on how to solve these very difficult thermonuclear problems that they were trying to solve. Okay, I want to keep going here. Now, when we got started, Teller was given, because he was the only one at the laboratory who had experience designing nuclear weapons, he kind of had a veto authority, but he was put in charge of the weapons program. And Edward had a premonition about what we call hydrides, that is mixing a uranium fuel, your uranium-235, with deuterium, which is an isotope of hydrogen. So the uranium deuteride, if you will, it's also called a hydride, became a weapon. If you will, it's kind of like mixing the fusion reactions going on in deuterium with the fission reactions going on with the uranium. It's a hybrid type of thing. And Edward was very enamored with this. And our first two tests were to test this concept, and they were absolute failures. Edward's designs were not very good. In other words, they were absolute failures. And nevertheless, Teller pushed forward, kept wanting to go with this idea. And in the very next year, when we had to put together a thermonuclear weapon, which was Teller's idea finally to put together an experiment for a thermonuclear weapon, that too was an absolute failure. And so we had 3 successive total failures. And people in Washington, people at Los Alamos wanted to see Livermore shut down as a failed experiment. The good ideas were not showing up. These people obviously didn't know what they were doing, and we needed to stop wasting money on them. The stakes were huge. At the same time that this happened, by the way, Oppenheimer had his Q clearance revoked. That is his top secret clearance, had been revoked at the order of President Eisenhower because of Oppenheimer's association with communists. And because he had lied to Army inspectors who he lied to them about the Communist Party's attempts to get atomic secrets from him during the Manhattan Project. And for that, his clearance was withdrawn. But in order to make the case, the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission wanted Lawrence, Teller, David Griggs, Louis Alvarez to be witnesses to state how Oppenheimer had tried to stymie thermonuclear research, and they did. And for that performance, especially by Teller on TV, he was ostracized by practically the entire physics community of America. I've interviewed physicists who worked here in the 1950s, and they told me, Tom, the first time I even heard the word Livermore was in graduate school, and that was to sign a petition condemning the place. It was just, this place became very unpopular because This was the era of McCarthyism, and the physicists at Livermore who had basically testified about Oppenheimer's behavior were ostracized because they felt they were being McCarthyist, or which was not good at the time. The stress was so great that Lawrence and Teller both came down with attacks of colitis and were hospitalized. Herb York also got sick with valley fever, that fungus that grows in this part of the world. And so the three leaders of the laboratory were either in a hospital or bedridden. And so the whole weapons program devolved onto two young people, Harold Brown and Johnny Foster. Harold Brown on the right is 27 years old there. Johnny is 32 years old. The entire weapons program in the laboratory fell on their lap. And the stakes were such that because the laboratory had three successive failures, one more failure would mean closure of the lab would just be no more. It would be just a bad experiment, if you will. You would think in those circumstances that those two gentlemen would simply copy a Los Alamos weapon, take it out to Nevada, test it, and get everyone off their get them off their back, but they didn't. Instead, they both came up with highly innovative, revolutionary designs for warheads. They were driven. They wanted to do something that would advance the science. And they were both eager to do that. They both had the guts to do it. They were both smart individuals. They were both very accomplished experimentalists. When they went through and did something, it worked. That's a rare talent, but they both had that. They both had that type of grit about them. In the bottom picture, you see what Johnny Foster's group came up with was an atomic bomb called the Cleo. It was so small, it could fit inside two of those Samsonite suitcases. And that's a San Jose State electrical engineering intern, a summer intern at the lab, carrying that thing for Walt Arnold, who was the engineer in charge of assembling the thing at Nevada. And they drove it from Livermore out to Nevada in the back of a Woody station wagon. That's another story. I think I don't have enough time to go through it, but they took it up and it worked. It worked perfectly. It was the laboratory's first great success. 2 weeks later, Brown's group came up with a device called the Linda. It was very, very revolutionary. It turned the whole previous idea of a thermonuclear weapon on its head, but it was incredibly smaller than anything that had ever been seen before. They took it up there, and on its very first try, it worked perfectly. It was within a couple of percent of what they predicted it would do. Brown said at the time, if this works, it will revolutionize the way thermonuclear weapons are built. And he was absolutely right. He was more prescient than he could have known. Because of the great success of those, finally, critics got off the backs of the physicists and scientists at Livermore and quit trying to shut it down. And instead, they built our Site 300, which is a high explosives testing facility up in the hills behind the lab, up in the Altamont. And also they moved Sandia Livermore to, that's the birth of Sandia Livermore. It's right after the teapot shots, the Cleo and the Linda, in which now a team led by a physicist named Bill Marsh arrived, took over one of the barracks buildings, and Sandia Livermore then started up to support Livermore Laboratory into getting weapons into the national stockpile. And in fact, the Sandia group was right there and helped to get Laboratory's first weapon into the stockpile, the W-27. Now, at the time, there was a big argument going on within the laboratory, within the country, about how viable our nuclear deterrent was. By this time, Stalin had died. He was replaced by a thug named Khrushchev, and they were making lots of noises, the Russians, about taking over Western Europe. And the Eisenhower administration, which was President Eisenhower was in charge at the time, they had a strategy that if the Russians were up to any no good, if they did any kind of aggression, the United States would respond with its total nuclear arsenal. And that was seen to be an untenable strategy because it was felt you were not going to start World War III over some incursion in Europe. You know, the United States would not risk destroying itself over that. And the other thing is that if that was our strategy, then all of our weapons were these huge, monstrous thermonuclear weapons. You see a B-17 there. That was the standard weapon. It's huge. It's 46,000 pounds. It's so big, the Air Force had to design a bomber to carry it, B-36 bomber, one bomber carrying one bomb. And these were all placed in Strategic Air Command air bases. They were well known where they were. And the argument was, what would prevent the Russians from taking a surprise attack and dropping an atomic bomb on each of these SAC bases and destroying the entire nuclear deterrent force of the United States in one fell swoop? Boom. There would be nothing to hold back the Russians then. And so our deterrence strategy rested on a bed of sand. And the theorists that I talked about earlier, the Herman Kahns, the Bill Kaufmans working at Livermore, came up with an alternative strategy. But in order for that strategy to work, the weapons needed to be a lot smaller than that B-17. They needed to be survivable, so that they just had to be much smaller. And working with the physicists and engineers at the laboratory set out to design weapons that were smaller. As one example, that B-17, Mike May, one of our more successful physicists, led a team and designed the B-41, which was 1/4 the size of that thing that you're looking at, and yet it outperformed them. But it was so small, you didn't need a huge bomber. You could put it on fighter bombers and other aircraft, if you will. But the real crux of this came from the Navy. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ollie Burke, came up with an idea. Well, if we want a survivable deterrent, why not launch our bombs from submerged submarines, from missiles launched from submerged submarines? You can't sneak attack a submerged submarine because you have no idea where it is. And so the Navy set out to building this thing. The problem was that a thermonuclear weapon was way too big to fit inside a small missile that could fit inside a submarine. And so at a conference in 1956 called the NOPSCA conference, Edward Teller stood up and told Admiral Burke, the Livermore lab could deliver a thermonuclear warhead for your small missile by 1961. And when Burke asked Harold Agnew at Los Alamos, can they do that? Agnew said, it's never been done, and it would take a lot more than 5 years to accomplish. But Burke turned around. He had an accomplished physicist from Livermore saying they could do it, and he awarded a contract to Livermore. All right, come up with a warhead that can fit within a fleet ballistic missile, which later became known as Polaris. Well, the laboratory set out on it, had a highly aggressive system. I wish I could spend more time telling you all the great things they accomplished, but that picture on the right shows two gentlemen holding up the banner. The man on the left, the tall gentleman, that's Jim Frank. On the far right is Mike May, who I've talked about. Jack Rosengren is also behind the banner. We successfully developed a warhead for Polaris, something that weighed less than 1,000 pounds. And you see the launch of that. And it happened just in time. The first Polaris submarine was launched in 1960. Well, in November 1960, the nation elected John F. Kennedy to be president. And within a few months, Khrushchev and Kennedy meet in Vienna, Austria at a summit. And Khrushchev issues an ultimatum to Kennedy, telling him, I want all American troops out of West Berlin because the Red Army, the Soviet Army, is going to occupy Berlin and we're taking over. Get out or there will be war. You'll have to pay the consequences. Kennedy was struck. It was a hell of a situation he was being placed in. Kennedy knew he was not going to give up West Berlin. There were 2.5 million citizens there that he was not going to subject to communism. But he had to face this threat coming from Khrushchev. But Kennedy later admitted he had the backbone to stand up to Khrushchev and not budge an inch because he knew with the Polaris, he had a weapon system that Khrushchev could not get away with it without destroying himself. And Kennedy admitted that gave me the backbone to stand up to him. And then Khrushchev blinked. And the crisis stopped when Khrushchev built the Berlin Wall. That's the reason the Berlin Wall was built, to stop this nuclear crisis of 1961. Now, 6 months later, Kennedy thought about what had happened. And he thought about the physicist back at Livermore who had given him a system, a weapon system that became the backbone of the defense of the nation. And he wanted to thank the physicist out here. So he flew out to Berkeley, to the Rad Lab. That's a pic on the left. That's a picture of him standing in front of the Rad Lab. On the far left is Norris Bradbury. He's the director of Los Alamos. And he's looking away from the scene, which is kind of symbolic that Los Alamos had its heyday in World War II when it developed the atomic bomb that ended World War II. The other individuals, that's Johnny Foster. Next to him is Edwin McMillan and Glenn Seaborg, the co-discoverers of plutonium, the president and Edward Teller, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, and there's Harold Brown, head of the Megaton Group. They're all facing and smiling at the president. They gave the president what he needed to get us through the country through the Cold War. They gave us a deterrence strategy that got us through the Cold War. The president came out to specifically thank these individuals. He later stepped to those doors, by the way, and he shook hands with people like Mike May and said, thank you. Mike May later told me that was the proudest day of his life. On the far right, you can see Kennedy. There's 85,000 people in the Berkeley football stadium. Kennedy is addressing them, and he tells them, I'm forced to an uncomfortable truth that his administration owes more to Berkeley than it does to Harvard. There was a direct public attribution to Livermore for averting a nuclear war, keeping the country out of nuclear war. So our young scientists, they were in their 20s, maybe early 30s, made it a tremendous accomplishment and got our country through the Cold War without us ever having to exchange nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union. It's quite an accomplishment. It's part of our legacy. Now, all of this is written up. I've written it up in a book. The Livermore Library has 4 copies of it. I'm told it's often being taken out, but if any of you are interested, go to the library, sign it out, and enjoy learning about our legacy and what happened at Livermore back in the 1950s. And with that, I'm going to pass it on. Back to you, Sally.
Wow, Tom, thank you so much. Just incredible history. And I know, as you said, we could probably spend the entire afternoon listening to you with these stories. It's really remarkable. So thank you for sharing that with us today. We do have a couple of minutes. If anybody has a pressing question they'd like to pose in the chat, we can do our best to address it. I thought, since you ended on the book, Tom, perhaps you could share a little bit about what that process has been like in terms of pulling all of this history together in that book and how you approached it.
I learned a lot. I had no idea of how important Rand Corporation was, for example, at the laboratory. I had no idea that we had made those close developments for the president. I had no idea about how serious the Berlin crisis was in 1961. I didn't put it in the book because it's hard for me to justify it in an unclassified way, but when he came back from meeting with Khrushchev, Kennedy went to the Pentagon and he said, well, what's the plan, General? And General Lucius Clay, responsible for the defense of Germany, said, sir, if the Red Army invests Berlin, then we're going to send a tank-heavy task force out of Frankfurt to relieve it. Any Russian formation that tries to head us off will meet with a tactical nuclear weapon. And Kennedy said, okay. That's how close we were. The president had already given, okay, we are not going to give up Berlin, even if it means going to nuclear war with the Soviet Union. People don't know that. I didn't know that. We all don't know that. We all know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Blah, blah, blah. This thing was a lot more serious, which is why we don't know about it. And I'm so proud of the fact that Livermore played a pivotal role in enabling us to get through that crisis so well. I was pleasantly surprised. It was a pleasure to write about it.
That's fantastic. Thank you. One other question I had, since I know we have a number of students in the audience today, is from your experience at Livermore, what advice would you offer to this next generation of scientists and engineers as they're exposed to Livermore this summer and hopefully in the years to come?
Follow your heart. That's what I think I've always done. Of course, I didn't grow up dreaming to be a thermonuclear weapon designer or a nuclear weapons designer. I was going to I was going to discover some brand new high energy physics particle or something. That's what we all dream with. But once I arrived at Livermore, then I really got absorbed by the physics, which Mike May said the same thing to me. Mike May also had dreams of doing other things, but once he got involved, he got absorbed by the physics and enjoyed the knowledge. I mean, there was a lot. The laboratory really is a fertile ground for lots of new ideas to go. And so if you are young and you're energetic, you have ideas, and it's a place you can accomplish things. And so follow your dreams, follow the stuff that you love doing, whatever science it be, chemistry, computer science, physics. There's room for everyone to make improvements. The work at the lab going on with additive manufacturing, with artificial intelligence, with physics, nuclear physics or other forms of physics is just astounding, or engineering, advanced forms of engineering. So it's a wonderful place to exercise your dreams and just follow them.
That's great advice. Thank you so much, Tom, for kicking off our speaker series this summer. It was great to have you. At this time, we'd like to ask the Livermore Lab Foundation student fellows to stay on our Zoom for a special Q&A time with Tom. And for the rest of you, we hope to see you again in 2 weeks for our next installment of the speaker series with Livermore physicist Tammy Ma. She'll be talking about igniting the stars with inertial fusion. So thank you so much, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Students, please stay on a moment if you can.